Hey everybody, welcome to Practice Makes Faithful. My name is Ben Patterson, joined by Paul Hugabart.
Yeah, man, I'm here this morning. Sleepy.
Yes, sir. We are in Season 3, Episode 18, and we are excited to dive into this conversation into a brand new series today, which we'll jump into in just a minute.
Yeah, yep.
How's the weekend been, Paul?
Good weekend. I mean, I feel like maybe, I don't know. I always feel like after a weekend it must have been a real busy one because I'm sleepy on what is for us Monday morning. But, you know, I think maybe everybody talks about that really with Monday mornings, right? That it's just kind of hard to get back in the groove. We begin with an early Monday morning prayer call, and so of course getting up a little bit earlier, maybe about an hour earlier, to be able to do that prayer call and then getting the kids to school, and they're always groggy on Mondays. But by Wednesday, we're rocking and rolling. I think I've said that before.
Yes,
sir. So right now, what you can count on is that Ben and I, neither of us are sleepy anymore. We are back in the saddle. So
there you go.
How about you?
Man, it's been good. It has been a really cool weekend at GC. We've had several different grad parties I've been to this weekend, and we had actually our milestone Sunday celebration at Grace Chapel, which is a really cool event. We started a few years back where we started kind of coupling together these two events of baby dedication and our senior celebration, putting those together on this one-day milestone celebration, which is about celebrating these really significant markers in a young person's life. They're kind of these moments of transition as we look at how far they've come and look at what is to come in their life.
Exactly
it was a really special day. We celebrated youth night, our senior celebration. Give out our what we call ultimate awards to our seniors. It was a fun time.
Cool.
It was a good night. Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, I think the idea of milestones is definitely significant. You know, it's kind of how we mark the passing of time with these really significant events. You know, there's so much that's probably happened in our lives. You know, for me, 44 years, looking backwards, there are all these details that I have forgotten, but there are certain things that I absolutely remember and have held on to. You know, those are those mile markers, and we hope to be able to celebrate those, like you said, with our young families and then with our graduating seniors and their families as well. So definitely very special moment.
For sure. Awesome. So as we launch into this series, we're in this new series called 2 Timothy in These Last Days. Will you tell us what is this series about? Why are we doing this? Why 2 Timothy? Give us a little bit of context around this.
Yeah, so it's a pretty neat letter that the Apostle Paul is writing to Timothy, who was one of his disciples, a young disciple, one who he'd really probably led to faith, although Timothy had his grandmother and his mother who had poured into him, who had invested in him. But certainly we see probably one of the most significant spiritual influences in his life was the Apostle Paul. In fact, Timothy goes along on some missionary journeys with Paul. He is the one that Paul leaves or sends to Ephesus. And so these letters were written to Timothy when he was at Ephesus from the Apostle Paul, 1 and 2 Timothy. Both 2 Timothy written while Paul was in prison. He's writing this letter to Timothy and just really encouraging him, again, as he did in 1 Timothy as well. I mean, 1 Timothy 4 is one of, most famous passages or most widely read passages when we think about young people. Paul encouraging Timothy to not let anyone look down upon him for his youth, but to set an example for these older believers in love, faith, speech, purity. And so, that's big. But then in 2 Timothy, the Apostle Paul kind of takes all of these ideas further, especially as it relates to Timothy and the leadership that he now has in this church in Ephesus, and his call to really work to protect his own faith as God is working to protect that faith. Then beyond that, the call that he has to pass that faith on to others, the call that he has to stand firm in the last days as many things are attacking and assailing his faith. And so really it's a letter from an older believer who's discipled a younger believer saying, man, all these things that I have seen grow in you because I took the time to pour into you and seed in you, all these things that have grown, keep going this direction. I'm not always going to be around. I won't always be here for you. And so the Apostle Paul is encouraging Timothy to keep going what started growing, in a sense.
Yeah.
And so it's a great letter of encouragement, I think super applicable to what we were talking about yesterday as we think about this Milestone Sunday. And I always try to pick out a message that will engage our graduating seniors and is a challenge to them. It's kind of a, if I were to give your graduation speech, basically, what do they call that at graduations? The keynote,
is it commencement?
Commencement,
speech?
The commencement. There you go. I was going to say convocation. No, it's not that. It's commencement. If I were to give the commencement speech at a graduation and I were to get to do it from a very biblical perspective, I always think about what would I want to say. And so sometimes, we've done Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the call, hey, stand up. When everybody else is bowing down, you stand up, stay strong. This message from 2 Timothy chapter 1 is really along those lines. Again, but from the Apostle Paul's perspective, speaking words of love and truth and grace and encouragement and exhortation into Timothy's life. And so got to relay those words to our graduating seniors, their families, and issue a challenge to everyone else out of that too, as part of what we were doing. We can talk a little more about that if you want to, and flesh that out a little bit further as well. But really with this letter, it is all from that perspective. The Apostle Paul saying, here's what I want you to be thinking about, Timothy. And we're going to walk through that for 4 weeks this month of May.
Awesome. So where'd you get started in this?
Yeah, yesterday I love the way that the Apostle Paul begins by painting this imagery as he says to Timothy, 2 Timothy 1:6, he says, "For this reason I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands." And so Paul acknowledging there's something incredible in you. It came from God through my investment in you. The idea of laying on hands is the idea of a passing on. So what I have, I passed on to you. Now, certainly there was often spiritual significance to that. The laying on of hands sometimes conveyed the gift of the Holy Spirit. Certainly miraculous manifestations of the Holy Spirit in the first century. We know we see that in other places. But Paul is basically saying, I laid on my hands as a way of passing on what was in me to you. And now this gift of God is in you. And what he does is he tells Timothy, he gives this imagery, this metaphor in a sense of a growing flame. So fan into flame. Now for first century people, this idea of taking and cultivating a small spark and turning it into a flame would have been obvious. They didn't have stoves like we have at home. You don't just get to turn on the gas burner or turn on the electric burner and now you can cook or heat your house with gas, or whether you have a heat pump or whatever it is that you have. For them, all of that revolved around fire. So there was some real significance to that. And so Paul is using this imagery to really impress upon Timothy the need to purposefully cultivate the gift of God, basically. It's saying, I want to remind you that what is in you has to be purposefully cultivated, okay? And so he uses this imagery of fire, and so I talked a little bit on Sunday about the idea, I love to watch these survival shows. In fact, I've gone out and I've tried to do some of this on a couple of occasions with some friends over the years, where we're basically trying to take very little and go and survive, what people would consider primitive camping, basically. Yeah. And so can we take what we find, take what we catch, take what we, and slowly work that up to where we now have something that is livable and sustainable. And it's wild. Taking the things that you find, I can remember being on this island with, we actually did this with our youth group when I was still working in youth ministry in Florida. I wish I could remember what we called these events. We did it for several years, but we'd take folks out and they had to work to build something that was sustainable. And so, you take what you find on this island. We went to this island called Cayo Costa in Florida one time. And so, the kids gathering dry grasses and all these things that they could get together, and they had just a flint and, like a magnesium lighter. And so, watching them try to get this fire going with just the ingredients they could find and the little things we gave them. And, so of course we as we as counselors are doing the same in that, and we got our fire going a lot more quickly than others. But even in saying that, it's difficult to get a fire going with just the things that you have around you, and so it really starts to bring to mind this idea of what it takes to take this spark, and it's easy to, if you got one of those magnesium rods, you can make sparks happen pretty quickly, so by taking the back of a knife and running along that rod, you're creating sparks pretty quickly, but that spark does not become a flame without a lot of hard work. And even if you can get that spark to take and become a small flame and then move into being an ember, then you have to slowly add to that increasingly significant fuel. So you might start with some dry leaves and then you move to some dry grass, and everything has to be dry. I mean, if you put anything wet on that, you kill the fire right away. It's not an easy task. And again, for anybody who's watched survival shows, what's the one that's so big on Alone, that's it right now. Yeah. So Alone is the really big one right now. It used to be, back in the day when I was kind of younger, it was Bear Grylls, or
Man vs. Wild.
Les Stroud, Survivor Man. I mean, my boys have loved watching this guy, Hayden Ozell, and I can't remember what his show is. I don't know. So they all got different names that are like Call of the Wild and Survivor and, all this stuff's got to do with survival, right? But in all these shows, there's this pretty common theme that fire it's this necessary element. So you can see the lengths that these guys will go to create fire and to sustain that fire, to keep that fire going. And so that's what the Apostle Paul starts with, this imagery as he's talking to Timothy about the gift of God that is in him, this faith in Jesus Christ that lives in him that is now growing. This growing relationship with the work of the Holy Spirit in him, the growing relationship with God himself. And Paul is saying over and over and over again, work to fan this thing into flame. There are things that'll come and threaten that flame, and you've got to guard it. Basically this encouragement that God is working to guard what he's put in you, but you guard it too. Right? So be purposeful in that. So really, that's kind of the message that I tried to share with, with our graduating seniors, but making it applicable to everybody too, because, even at later stages in life, I can think about times where the fire of God is burning brightly in me, and maybe I start to neglect that fire and I don't add fuel to the fire, and then something comes and attacks it, And we'll talk about some of those things that can attack the faith that we have, and how easy it is if we've been neglecting that fire of faith for that fire to start to go out or to dwindle and need to be rekindled. And so really it's a message that's really truly applicable to everyone. We don't have to be the younger disciple that an older disciple is counseling. It can be any one of us who are being counseled by the Word of God, as we read in 2 Timothy chapter 1, to really do everything we can to cultivate what God has put in us, to guard it, to cultivate it, to grow it, all those things.
That's good. So let's flesh that out a bit more.
Okay.
In the message on Sunday, you said that fanning a spark to a flame requires time, intentionality, and focus.
Yeah.
So let's get a little bit practical with that and say, what might that look like in the life of a young person to fan that spark into a flame? Yeah,
so again, just to reignite that imagery, really bad pun, right? But to bring that imagery back to mind, think about the way that somebody who is trying to get a fire going will hover over it. And we'll blow on that little ember and we'll guard it. We'll put his or her hands around it to guard it. And so there's this protection, there is this intentionality, there's this focus, there's the taking of time. You can't rush this thing. So there's patience with it, incredible patience that goes along with that. And so, so in the life of a young Christ follower, there are some real markers that either, I think, and it goes both ways. The reality is that we as older disciplers of younger people, we are taking time lots of patience, intentionality, focus to cultivate this, the flame of faith in their lives. And also, they have to take time because they're also cultivating that flame within their own lives. And so nobody is the fire in this sense, except maybe the fire of faith in God that's growing. Everybody's in the business of cultivating or of shaping that. And so we talked before about the book called Sticky Faith, written by Kara Powell and Chap Clark. And they did roughly a 5-year research project trying to figure out what it looked like and how faith stuck in the lives of some young folks when for so many it just didn't. They left home and that faith was not sticky anymore. Or we could say that the flame of faith was no longer fanned in them. And so I think some of these principles are mostly directed at church leaders or churches trying to help young people develop a stronger, more resilient faith. But really, we can see that you could take those principles and you could actually transfer some responsibility to young people as well. Because again, Paul is saying to Timothy in this passage, you take the responsibility to guard and to fan into flame what God has put in you already. So take that spark and you fan that flame, or you fan that spark into flame by being intentional, purposeful, patient with it. You do that yourself. And so, yes, the Apostle Paul was assuming his responsibility in trying to continue to fan that spark in Timothy, but was also telling Timothy, fan it into flame yourself. So again, there's ownership on both sides. I think we as older folks, we as older disciplers, we as church leaders, and even churches together have a responsibility to our young people, like a deep responsibility to our young people. Paul doesn't seem to talk about that right in this passage because he is showing by example right there the responsibility that he had for Timothy. He is very much showing by his words the reality of the ownership he wants Timothy to take for that flame, for that faith in his own life and the development of it, so that it's strong and resilient, all these things. And so I just want to go through real quickly. I think this is these are old notes, so I just went back and grabbed these notes. I didn't go back and look at the book, but here are some of the things that I remember the first time I looked this over stood out to me.
This is from Sticky Faith.
From Sticky Faith. From Sticky Faith. This idea that that one of the most important things to developing a sticky faith is what happens at home. So faith at home is incredibly important. And so the way that they talk through this is about the responsibility to develop a warm, loving family environment where faith is openly discussed and modeled. So conversation and example within the context of warm and loving family is one of the things that they found, that Chap Clark and Kara Powell found, is one of the indicators, key indicators as to whether or not a resilient and strong faith will develop and then be maintained in young believers.
That's good.
So what happens in the family is essential. And that's one of the things, one of the areas that here at Grace Chapel, we really want to devote time and resources to helping families develop this kind of environment. That's one of the kind of our themes this year, even in how we're going to engage as a staff, family ministry team. How can we help move this forward so that we're seeing the development of, again, this warm and loving environment where faith is talked about and where faith is modeled, right? I can remember sitting, and it's not to beat anybody up. It's just to tell the truth of an experience that I was a part of. This is close to 15 years ago at this point in time when I was still working in youth ministry myself. And I remember sitting in a room. We'd had some pretty tough things happen in our youth group. A number of kids who'd really stumbled in their faith, and some tough things had happened. I could tell you about what those things were, but I won't go into it. But just, imagine difficult things that can happen in youth group where young people have really struggled in their faith and have gotten into some trouble in the world, with the world around them and that kind of thing. And so we'd had a number of those instances in a row, and several parents were crying out for help and asking, what can we do? And so, I decided instead of just giving, or in addition to giving maybe specific situational advice and encouragement based upon what was happening with a young person in a given family, we need to bring the whole, all youth group parents together. And so we sat in a room with, probably between 30 and 40 parents that were concerned and interested that showed up for this meeting. And I remember asking in that meeting at one point in time, tell me what you guys are doing at home to really, to pass on faith to your own kids. What are you doing to cultivate this in your own homes? And that may not have been exactly how I asked it, of course, 15 years ago. So I don't remember exactly what words I used, but that was the basic gist of it. And I mean, it was like crickets in the room. I mean, nobody willing to raise their hand. That doesn't mean that nobody was doing anything. It just means maybe that nobody was willing to raise their hand until one lady at the back of the room raised her hand and she said, if I'm going to be honest, I wouldn't even know where to start. So basically saying, we haven't done anything. Our child is now in his mid-teenage years, moving toward latter teenage years, and we really haven't done anything. I wouldn't even know where to start at this point. And certainly, I mean, if you haven't really taken the time to talk about and model faith in the home, and now you're dealing with a 15, 16-year-old child, boy, I can understand not maybe really knowing where to start.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So that's very tricky. So starting early is really good, but it's never too late to start as well. And so, that's the first thing they found. We need to develop this warm, loving family environment where faith is openly discussed and modeled.
That's good.
But then beyond that, we need to build a church family is the second thing that they discovered. And so the goal of fostering intergenerational relationships within the church community, it is a lofty goal at times. I know it's difficult at times. I know sometimes it seems like, I know older folks who have felt at times and expressed like teenagers don't really want much to do with me. They just look at me and they feel like I'm this really old person. But then I've heard it from teenagers as well, to where they feel like older folks don't really want anything to do with it. So I think there's this kind of back and forth sort of tension that maybe is that seems larger than it actually really is. The gulf seems wider between younger folks and older folks than it really happens to be. But this is another key indicator where faith was sticky, is where intentional relationships, intergenerational relationships within the church community had been fostered. And so I know you can talk a little bit more as we go about our efforts toward that with an initiative here called Sticky Faith Partners. If you want to do that now, you can talk about that for sure. So it's one thing that we kind of made an effort to do in helping with students kind of bridging the gap as they're moving into this next phase of life, graduating, going out into college, workforce, whatever they're doing next, helping to keep them connected to the church family and in that broader sense of like this broader church family, not just their close group of friends. But we started this thing we called Sticky Faith Partners, playing off of this book, where we've just asked some adults at GC to partner with a college student, where they would commit to praying for them each week, reaching out to them, texting them, send them some encouraging notes, send a care package or two, that kind of stuff, and really just to invest in that student, invest in that next generation, which does twofold. It really helps that student in a difficult transition, right? Those first few weeks, you're going to college, you're trying to figure out, where's my new church family going to be like, and trying to help bridge that gap when they're away from their old church family. But then it is that intergenerational element. Like something that's been really cool is we'll have a lot of our older members in our Prime Timers ministry who will choose to reach out to a college student. And we're kind of bridging that gap. It's been a really cool thing. It's a really good thing because, and here's where I think sometimes the church does need to act as a catalyst to this, because there are some walls and barriers. There is a chasm that we have to get over. If the church sets up a scenario in which this is likely to almost bring people together for this purpose, it will start to break down some of those walls and some of those barriers that maybe are not as big of barriers as we thought they were, hurdles that are not so high to jump, that kind of thing. And so that's been a great thing here. I know my family, my wife in particular, has participated in that several times and built some really meaningful relationships with some recent youth group graduates that she has carried some of those relationships with her through the last several years, and it's always neat to see the way that she'll interact, and so it's gone from sending care packages, letters, and other things, texting, sending encouraging text messages, phone calls, that kind of thing when it's appropriate, to then when those young college girls, in her case, are in town. She's magnetically drawn to them. They're magnetically drawn to her. They're conversing in a way that's meaningful, and so it's the establishment of relationship that is meaningful, and is just another one of those key elements that is seen when stronger, resilient faith is present in younger people.
Yeah,
so
that's awesome.
The next one they have is the need to encourage young people to ask tough questions and explore their doubts, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in another follow-up question we've got, but yeah, I mean that's incredibly key. I've talked about before being in an environment where I actually had an older church leader say to me, as I was doing a series where I was trying to address some of the difficult questions that our kids in youth group had, basically say to me, well, we don't talk about those kind of things in church, and I lament that. I think his idea was well-meaning. I think he was afraid that if we talked about those things, talked about some of those difficult questions, that it actually would lead more of a focusing on those difficult questions, and then so we're afraid to bring up the difficult questions, or we're afraid to create an environment in which people can ask difficult questions, because talking about it is likely to mean that we're just going to keep going down that path, which research just does not support that. On the flip side, what research supports is when young people can ask their tough questions within the church environment, when the church environment is a safe environment for those discussions, that it actually helps them explore those doubts in a healthy and safe place, and oftentimes will help them navigate those doubts, and their faith will actually be stronger on the backside of that. So
and unfortunately, I do think that's one that feels counterintuitive to some folks. Like you're saying, there is some worry, some concern about exploring those questions, and maybe sometimes even a feeling of, I don't know how to answer those questions. And sometimes there can be some internal angst about that I can't answer that. I'm just taking that on faith, so I don't want to entertain that. And I think you're so right, and this research, I think, is so true on that.
Yeah. The idea that we're somehow validating or saying, yes, that is a reasonable, rational doubt, or a doubt that should derail your faith by just having the conversation is I think, a little bit shallow to me, to be honest. It's again, it all depends on how you engage those conversations, but it creates also this openness. If we create this environment where young people can ask tough questions, there's the opportunity for us to be honest and say, I've also wrestled with those tough questions at times. I've walked through them. The idea there's nothing new under the sun, basically. And so when young people are able to see some of us who are older, having walked through some of those tough questions, those challenges to faith, they're able to think, well, okay, so in my case, my preacher has also walked through wrestles and struggles with these questions. If he's walked through it and he's where he is currently, then it must be okay to wrestle like this, and it must not mean that my faith is coming to an end. This is just a momentary blip in my faith, or a question that I have regarding my faith. And so I think it's a healthy thing.
Just to create a culture to say it's okay to have some doubts. Like I don't see throughout Scripture, I don't see Jesus condemning people for having doubt. In my small group, we were studying Matthew chapter 11 this past week. There's this moment where John the Baptist is reaching out. He's in prison and he's reaching out to Jesus, and he's basically asking, like, "Are you really the Messiah?" He is expressing his doubt. He's a little unsure. He's sitting here in this prison cell, and he is questioning, is this really the right guy that I'm following?
Yes.
And Jesus, in his response that he sends back with his disciples, he, in a classic Jesus way, he doesn't give a direct answer. He says, look at this stuff,
That's
look,
right.
the blind
Yes.
see,
Yep.
the lame, and all this groovy
Yep.
stuff. But he doesn't condemn him. He doesn't
Right.
go back and be like, John, how could you doubt me? Like, I
Yeah.
thought you were loyal to me. Like, no, seems very like loving and compassionate.
Yes.
And it just, I don't see this posture from Jesus towards doubt that
Right.
sometimes we in the church have taken towards doubt.
Yeah. Many of the Psalms
Yeah.
express doubt or question, or why would you let this happen, God? How long are you going to let this happen? And so, I think there's a modeling of expressing of doubt in healthy ways.
For sure.
And so we can definitely do that here in the church as well.
So what's next?
Yeah, so what's next? So next they say, that we need to learn to provide opportunities for young people to serve and live out their faith in practical ways. And I would say, yes, very, very important.
For
so
sure.
in a programmatic way, we can in the church provide opportunities where young people can serve and live out their faith. Now, we certainly don't want service to only be tied to church programs. And so I think on the flip side of that, we ought to encourage, enable, champion, young people to go find opportunities to serve themselves. And so again, so that they're taking the initiative as well. And so in the vein of what Paul is doing with Timothy, where again, Paul is modeling what an older discipler is doing, what a church leader is doing. Of course, Timothy was a church leader himself, but Paul is saying, Timothy, you do these things. And I think in that, I could take just what Chap Clark and Kara Powell have said here and say, I think in that we ought to challenge young people to, in this moment, despite their youth, or even sometimes because of their youth, go find a place to serve. And you've got a giftedness to offer now. You've got goodness to offer to others now. You've got the image of Jesus to reflect now. And so don't wait till later. Go do this now. Now is the moment to serve and love others and live out your faith in a practical way.
I think that's so important for young people to make their faith their own in that way. When they're actually living that out, expressing it in that way. And I like what you said, that the church, we can provide some programs towards that to some extent, but we really want them to take that out and do it on their own in their daily life. And I even think the programs that we do should be pointing towards that. So I think of our New Orleans mission trip right now that we've been meeting with our team, preparing for that with a group of young people, a group of high school students. And in one sense, the New Orleans mission trip is kind of a means to an end that we're trying to disciple them to go out and live their lives on mission. So the goal is not just to go to New Orleans and do a 1-week mission trip. That's good, and that's helpful. I do think that we're doing good work over there and feel strongly in what we're doing. But the goal more of it is that when that student comes home, they will have had this catalytic experience where they're with a group of other young people who are all like-minded. There's just this focus that when you're on a mission trip, you're fully focused on this mission. And the goal would be that when they come home, then they start to see, there's similar problems right here in my home. There's also people living in homelessness here in Forsyth County. There's also all of these problems, these things that I've just experienced. How do I take what I just did in New Orleans and now do that back here at home? Or when I go to college or wherever I'm at in life. And a lot of times those programs should be pointing towards, how do I actually make this real in my life?
Yeah, and so we often talk about our programs here, even at the church, as we hope this is a catalyst to you embracing this in your own life. And so, it's even, it brings up the, I think the impetus for some programs to actually exist in a short-term fashion for the sake of saying, okay, we don't want to institute a program here, another new program. We want this to be a catalyst to help people do this other thing. And so, there'll be one day kind of service projects, or whether it be a mission trip for a week or even longer than that. The goal is that this would catalyze in you something, would equip you to do something on your own. And so definitely that is the hope.
So you got one more.
Yeah, one
What's
more.
This final
so
one?
The last one is this. So if we want to see a sticky or a stronger or more resilient faith develop in young people, there's also this call to connect faith to real life issues and show how this faith that we have makes a difference in the world. So it's interesting. I mean, I've been at preachers' meetings before where I think well-meaning preachers will say things like, well, I don't speak to current events. I just preach the Bible. I just preach the Bible. And I get that, especially some guys who are really moving back to expository preaching, which, man, I value that highly. I like to do a mix of expository preaching and topical preaching. Right now we're in an expository series. We're walking through 2 Timothy. So obviously I value expository preaching. But what I want to say to those guys sometimes is, hey, listen, I preach the Bible, and then I want to show why these words, even though they're 2,000-year-old words, apply to right now. And so, yes, I'm going to talk about current events. And really, that's what these guys are saying is, I preach the Bible, I don't talk about current events. And so it's this almost this aversion or this belief that if we really want to stay pure to the text, we should not bring in current events. But I think what that does is it creates this real kind of life disconnect between what we hear in Scripture and what difference those words make in our lives, in our actual lives. And so, I think for me that's a really, really important one. I always, when I preach, want to show how what we're hearing this morning connects back to real life and even current events. What you're going through right now. And for a long time, I mean, we just call this application. If the application is just super general and doesn't apply to more specific scenarios, then sometimes I wonder how much good we're actually doing people. If we've got something happening in the world right now, and this text speaks into what is happening right now and gives us would impart to us a frame of mind or a paradigm about that, what is happening right now, then I think we should make those connections and say, look, this is why even these 2,000-year-old words right now are shaping our worldview and how we would react to fill in the blank, and how we would think about this specific issue. And so, I think showing how the faith that we have in Jesus matters to the now, I think is pivotal for everybody, for all believers.
Totally agree. Yeah, because there can easily become this disconnect, and especially, I mean, for anyone, but maybe especially for young people in this context where my faith is over here, it becomes this thing I do at church, but then real life is out here when I leave the walls of the church, and I don't see how these two things mix.
Exactly
if we're not bringing in real world events and issues into the way we preach and the way we're talking. I think I was just looking for this quote. I could not find it. But I think it was from John Stott, but where it talks about this idea of like when he preaches, he holds the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, kind of thing. And just this idea of bringing that in, I think that is so important. Teaching students how to think about real world issues, about how to develop critical thinking, cultural discernment as they're going out into the real world. It's so important.
Yeah, I know you guys are right now here at Grace Chapel. GC Youth is in a series trying to help our young people develop the skills of cultural discernment.
Doing that specifically through media. Students, they're watching media all the time. I mean, constantly, whether it's scrolling through TikTok, watching their favorite YouTuber, watching Netflix in the evening, playing music in their car. And how do you live in that world as a Christian when most of that media that you're consuming is not Christian media? What do we do with that? How do we discern? Like, what's good? How do we learn to filter out and take some good pieces of truth? Because there are some good things in secular media. How do we take what's good in there and filter out the lies in there? And that's some of the stuff we've been talking about. It's been really good.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Yep.
Yes. Okay, so moving forward. You said that some of what the Apostle Paul says as he writes this letter to Timothy points to the fact that life will not always be easy. And there will be lots of things that will threaten the flame of faith in young people that we're seeking to cultivate. So would you just kind of go through, you kind of gave a list of 3 things.
Yeah.
What were those things that you mentioned on Sunday? Let's flesh those out a bit more.
Yeah, just, and this does connect back with what we were just talking about. The reality is that the way that we work to build and cultivate faith in young people, and the way that they would cultivate that faith in themselves as well, and the way that God is working to cultivate that faith, even as we've already talked about, that Paul ends this passage by saying, God is guarding, you guard it too, basically. God is guarding what he's already put in you, but you fan that into flame, is what Paul says to Timothy. And so there's this acknowledgement that if something needs to be guarded, both by Timothy himself and by God himself, that must mean that thing is somewhat under attack, or somebody's trying to steal that thing, right? So, why do we have to work so hard to cultivate sticky faith in young people? It's because, well, there are lots of things trying to unstick that faith in a sense. And so, we know the statistics on this. It's not good. It's been, I've seen at one point in time, I remember it was roughly 5 out of 6 teenagers who grew up in church walked away from faith in their 20s. And I think at one point in time it grew larger than that, to where it was something like 7 out of every 8 or 8 out of every 9. Super high numbers. We at Grace Chapel have tried to be very proactive in not letting those horrible statistics be true about us here and about our young people. But what it clearly exposes is there's a stickiness when you're in and among the church environment, and maybe when you're in your parents' home, but it becomes unsticky when you're out in the world, and there are some things that start to maybe attack and go after that faith. And so, just a few common things that certainly I have witnessed over the years. I've watched people go through difficult things, and I've experienced this myself. You go through trials, and just like the psalmist David, sometimes, but others as well, you start to ask the question, why, God? Why are you letting this thing happen? And the truth is, for many young people, they don't go. Many young people will go through their time living at home without experiencing a very difficult thing. Many young people, I'd say the majority of young people. That's not true for everybody. Some people have experienced serious and significant trauma. But as they get out of the home and as they grow older, they may start to experience some things that are much more traumatic. I know for the two of us, we did at younger ages experience traumatic things. I lost a really close friend and then a classmate within a 2-week span to separate car accidents in high school. And so, I'd experienced some serious trials that just really rocked my world. I know you experienced,
lost my mom when I was 15.
And so, it's not true about everybody, but it is true about a lot of folks, a lot of young people. And so you go through that first difficult trial, maybe in college or just out of college, and all of a sudden now you're asking questions. And it's not like these are questions that nobody else has ever asked, but if you ask these questions and you're only asking them of yourself or around your peer group, and your peer group is maybe not connected to church, it may not be a Christian peer group, you start to get this influence through these times of difficult trials, or difficult, just difficult times period that will shape you in that moment. And so, that's one of the things that can be, a threat. If you think about, a real fire, if you're trying to protect this real fire, the reality is that if the wind starts to blow, it can become difficult to keep that fire lit, especially in its infancy stages, or even as a fire starts to grow. If it starts to rain can put out, fires. Think about, the one thing that the firefighters are hoping for when there are wildfires, whether it be in California or some other places out west, or sometimes those we've seen in Australia. It's in a time where it hasn't rained for some time. They're hoping for rain because the rain will assist in putting out that fire. It may be the only thing that has a hope to put out that fire. And so, just as a real fire can be attacked by rain, sometimes wind, other things, other elements, our faith can be attacked by things from the outside. And so what would rain on us? What would be a wind that we could not survive in? Well, difficult times, and especially maybe the first real difficult experience that a young person faces could be one of those things. I mean, you think right now, we've walked through with families, I've walked through with other young people in the last number of years, when especially with the opioid epidemic right now. I mean, with the high rate of suicidality among young people right now. I mean, our young people are going to find themselves facing difficult things. I mean, it's becoming more commonplace, not less, and earlier, I think, than maybe it would have happened, in the last 100 years. Then they're just difficult questions. I mean, I can think about, one of my, certainly, I mean, we love them all, right? When we're in youth ministry, we love all the kids that we have, but some will be kind of, our favorites, the ones we really spend time with, just being honest. And so, I can think about probably one of my favorite kids in youth group during the time that I was in youth ministry, who went off to a Christian college of all places and found himself up against some difficult challenges to his faith that he'd never considered before. And within 2 semesters, he dropped out, come home, and completely walked away from faith. Wow. And I spent time trying to wrestle through those difficult questions with him, and it made me really feel like, man, I just did not equip him well enough. But difficult questions, the first time you bump up against, maybe a real philosophical challenge to faith, or a scientific challenge to faith, or, you can insert other things into those blanks. It can send you reeling, or somebody's challenging the credibility of the Bible, or saying, hey, that's just old and archaic. Why in the world are we going to listen to that? Or you start to see that, Scripture does demand this level of self-denial and coming to the things of God and the plans of God for our lives, and maybe we're wrestling up against that, just even with the past series that we talked about. Questions about ethics and sexual morality or immorality, and things that God calls us to, but the world is saying is okay. Even though God is calling us out of those things, and now you're wrestling with that question, and you're just not sure how to make heads or tails of it. Man, there are a lot of difficult questions that can really make somebody feel like their flame of faith is under attack. And so, so that, and then, just here's the other truth. I mean, I have no idea who said this. It's been said so long, but show me your friends and I'll tell you who you are, kind of thing. So, we can build our deepest relationships within the community of God. So we already kind of talked about this in Sticky Faith, in the Sticky Faith discussion, but we can build our deepest relationships around, within the community of God. And those, maybe those life anchor type relationships. But often when people leave home, they start to build their community, maybe not, within the community of God. And so, just the loss of Christian connection, the encouragement that comes with Christian connection, the challenge that comes with it, maybe the challenge to these thinking patterns that start to develop as you face difficult trials and difficult questions and other things like that. That is another thing that again, so we've touched on most of these in the Sticky Faith conversation, but I think we need to acknowledge that this is often where the attacks to that flame of faith come.
Yeah. So, all right. So let me ask. So, and I know we're starting to get low on time, but so let's say we have a person who did not have these things we've talked about that helps with Sticky Faith. They didn't have the love, the family where faith was cultivated. They didn't have those intergenerational relationships. They didn't have a place to explore the questions, and they just didn't have these resources. And now they're at a spot where they feel like these threats against their flame, it's coming against them. They feel like their faith is under attack. Maybe they're even questioning if it's even worth moving forward. Like, should I just give up on this? Like, I've got all these attacks that are coming up against my faith. What is the point in continuing to fight?
Yeah.
What would you say to that person?
Yeah, so one, I mean, don't give up without a fight. You know, I mean, that's the first thing I'd say, is that I think too often people give up without a fight. And often the giving up is motivated by something else. You know, so the difficult questions emerge, and I'm willing to walk away and not really wrestle with these difficult questions because maybe I actually don't want to live the lifestyle that God is calling me into, the lifestyle of self-denial. So even, questioning the pureness of motives, if somebody is thinking about walking away from faith, I'm not saying the attack isn't real. I'm just saying if our strongest desire is to walk faithfully with God, we'll often learn to navigate the attack. If our motives are maybe a little bit off, then sometimes we can almost give ourselves permission to allow this to be the reason that we walk away. I would say this too, there are so many good resources. If somebody is struggling with difficult questions, and oftentimes it's the difficult times that bring about the difficult questions, so if that is the case, if somebody is wrestling with difficult questions, there are so many great outlets. I'll have to go back and look and see. There's one that those of us who are connected with Renew, there's a Renew contributor that does an awesome job and has got a website that has anticipated lots of these difficult questions where really good, satisfactory, meaty answers can be found to these difficult questions. So the challenges are real, but the good answers are real too. And so, I would say, to somebody who feels like that flame of faith is under attack, is one, realize that the attacks come. The attacks are real, and of course they come. But the fact that that flame of faith is under attack may actually lend more credence to the real nature of your faith. Because if the flame of faith is under attack, why is it being attacked, and who's attacking it? And so for those of us who have a biblical worldview, I mean, we would have to go and say, well, the Apostle Paul tells us very, very plainly that there's an enemy who's out to get us. We have this armor that we can put on, as Ephesians 6. We've got this armor that we can put on. We can not put the armor on if we want to, but we also have the shield of faith that is there to help us extinguish the flaming arrows of the enemy. So I would say those are the attacks, and in that the metaphor kind of breaks down, because the enemy's not like shooting flaming arrows to help build our fire further. He's actually shooting these arrows to help kind of destroy that flame of faith, to put it out. And so, I think I would say, the advice that I would give to someone who feels like, the flame of faith is under attack is realize where those attacks are coming from. Realize that there are things that you can do to arm yourself and guard yourself against that attack. And even if you didn't grow up with a Christian community that was solid, it's not too late to find one. Even if you didn't grow up in an environment where you could ask difficult questions, it's not too late to find that environment. Seek that out. And maybe it's online. I'll see if I can link this resource, if I can track it down before we post here on Wednesday. There are so many things we can do to be proactive. So don't stop fighting. Actually, don't give up the fight. Fight harder, because your faith is worth fighting for. Because this is what I think this is what gives us real meaning and purpose in life. This is how we know what life is really about. Everything else is just aimless and drifting, and so this is where the anchor for the soul is found. And so don't give that up.
Awesome. Well, as we close, Paul, what would you say? How can we practice what we've learned to be faithful to Jesus?
Yeah, just real quick to reconnect with that. This requires, again, if we think about, what I tried to say about this idea of, fanning a spark to a flame, the fact that it requires time and patience, and then it requires intentionality and focus. And all this is true, and that's why the Apostle Paul uses this imagery, because his folks, the people he was writing to, Timothy, would have been extremely familiar with, in the first century, the time and patience, the intentionality, the focus that it takes to fan this spark to a flame, and to see that flame become a burning, roaring fire, which is what he wanted for his young disciple, Timothy. We're familiar with it as well because survival shows are like all the rage nowadays, right? And so we know what that looks like. So if it's true about a spark to flame, that it requires this patience, this time, this intentionality and focus, let's take the same attitude about faith. And I think then, as I've said, I put two categories on this, young people or churches and church leaders. I would say take initiative.
Yeah. Here's
the challenge out of this. If we're gonna take what we've talked about and be more faithful to Jesus, here's the truth. We too often leave the development of our faith or the faith of others to chance. We think that what we're doing by gathering on Sunday morning is somehow enough. And let me tell you, it's not a drop in the bucket, right? We need so much more than just coming together for an hour or sometimes two on Sunday morning. We need so much more than that. We need relationships throughout the week. We need to take initiative in our own devotional lives. As I sang the little song, and I won't sing it again here on Sunday morning, but what I can remember going back to Sunday school class, sitting in a Sunday school class, and the teacher helping us sing the song, read your Bible, pray every day, and you'll grow, grow, grow. Just that basic step of being in Scripture and letting that shape us, of praying and developing a relationship with God. Just these very basic things that seem so basic, but they're not just basic, they're foundational. And then everything grows up from and out of that. I would say don't forsake the basics because they're basic, or don't forsake what's simple, and don't assume that what's simple is simplistic. It's not. These things are foundational to who we are. And so let's not leave the development of our faith or the faith of others to chance. That would be my challenge. So if someone is listening right now and they are leaving the development of their own faith to chance, become purposeful about it. Take the time, be intentional, be focused about it. And if God is moving you to connect with a young person, to help them learn to become intentional and focused and patient and all that, then seize that opportunity. I bet you'll find more receptivity there than you would have imagined.
I love that. I just want to add one more thing on that too. It's less of a practice, but I would just encourage you to, just in this conversation we've had about the book, Sticky Faith, I would encourage you to read Sticky Faith. It's excellent. We'll link to this in the podcast. I just think these principles, these key components of what makes faith stick are so helpful for all of us to be aware of. If there's parents listening to this, to know these things, like you want your kids' faith to stick when they leave the house, right? So how do you cultivate an environment in the home through the other places where your students are engaging? Like how do you cultivate an environment where their faith sticks? If you are a leader of the next generation, you're a small group leader or something, these principles are so important. If you are a grandparent or you're a prime timer listening to this, like these are just such important things that we want to create a church that is cultivating an environment where faith will stick in the next generation, where at least we're doing everything that we can do to help to make faith stick, because it is staggering how many students do walk away from the faith, and we do not want that to be the way it is here at Grace Chapel. And if there are these things that we could do that research shows is really helping to make faith stick, let's do that. So I would encourage you, check out that book as kind of a side practice. Check that out, read that, see what you can do to be the kind of person that is actively working to help make faith stick.
Yes, that's awesome, Ben.
Awesome. Hey, well, that is all we got for today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you, Paul.
Likewise, Ben.
Yes, and we hope you all join us next week for part 2 of this series, In These Last Days. We look forward to hearing from y'all.